These are 8 true truck driver stories from America's highways. They get worse the longer you listen. When I say true, I mean drivers calling in, calling a friend, filing reports with troopers, and, in some cases, seeing officers and FBI agents at a loading dock. Names have been changed, mile markers kept vague to protect privacy, and where investigations are still open, I'll say so. These are not campfire tales. They're accounts from people whose nights are the long, dark miles most of us only imagine, and every one of them starts with something that seems small: a crackle on the CB, a set of hazard lights, a hitching thumb. Trust is a tool on that road, and in these stories, it gets used against the people who rely on it the most. If you make your living behind a wheel, you'll hear the industry words sprinkled through these voices: CB channels, four-ways, sleeper berth, dash cam. But I'll keep it clear for everyone listening. Pay attention to the little details. The clues the drivers noticed are what kept them alive. After the first account, I'll ask a favor. If this thread of road horror is your thing, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next batch. Now listen to the first voice. It was 2 in the morning. I had the rig steady at 62, low cloud ceiling, light rain that turned the highway into a ribbon of reflected lights. I was on I-40 through Arkansas, freight for a regional courier, a flatbed with tarps pulled tight. I'd been on the road for 20 hours and was looking for a place to rest my eyes, the kind of tired where your shoulders ache inside your jacket. Channel 19 was buzzing, the usual check-ins and a guy offering a spare coffee. Then she came on, voice high and raw. "Help, please. I'm at mile marker, something. Please, someone stop." She said it fast, like she hadn't finished a breath. It wasn't the usual stranded call. It had a tremor, and she sounded young, scared. I flipped my four-ways on and eased over, thinking about the warm cab and a shower in the truck stop. I remember thinking, if it's a woman out here, I stop. You do, I do. It's what you do on the highway. That's how people survive. When I pulled in, her hazard lights were on. They were oddly perfect, steady, almost too bright, like someone had just replaced bulbs. No smoke from an engine, no steam. Not even that little hum you get when a battery's heating up. Her truck, it looked recent, plates covered with frost from the rain. The parking lot felt empty, because the lights over the pumps were dimmed, like someone had left a theater between acts. I walked up the passenger side and saw footprints leading into the trees. Not many, but deliberate. There was a little kid's backpack on the passenger seat, damp. I called over the CB. "You good there? Need a hand?" She answered right away. "Yes, please, I've got to get to town. Please, I can't." That's when I saw it. A shape in the woods, like someone standing between trunks, watching.
I didn't get a great look, just the silhouette of a person hunched, fingers catching moonlight. 10 yards deeper, there was a tarp folded, a 2-person chair set up. From where I stood, I could hear a muffled laugh, and not from the woman in the cab. Something about it didn't sit right. The hazard lights on her truck were too clean, the footprints too staged, the backpack placed like a prop. The voice on the CB kept calling for help, but every time a car rolled by it seemed rehearsed to get attention. I wasn't a rookie. I've been on these roads for 20 years. I made a show of walking back toward my truck, then slid behind the wheel and eased out of the lot. I didn't run. I didn't want to spook whoever was out there and make them bolt into the interstate. I put some distance between us, kept her in the mirror. The person in the trees didn't move. The woman's shoulders hunched as if someone had placed a gun to her back. Maybe it was a fight. Maybe it wasn't. I began calling other trucks on the channel, low voice, an old trick. Anybody at the nearby exit? I gave a code for a trucker I knew who was usually awake. No answer for a minute. Then Buck answered and said he was 10 minutes northbound. I told him to hold the channel open and described what I saw. As soon as I moved to the lane, 2 trucks pulled out of the shadows and circled the lot, just to keep things in sight, nothing cinematic. The person in the trees broke into a run, disappearing into the woods. That should have been it, but as I pulled off the exit, I saw a pickup slow, then stop, right at the mouth of the lot where you can see cars come in. 2 men climbed out and took up positions where they could see every vehicle coming through. It looked like a setup. I called 911 and told the dispatcher what I'd seen. Possible ambush, 2 men acting odd, a woman possibly coerced. State police answered 20 minutes later. I could see the lights through the rain. They were already aware of similar calls in the area, they told me. The same radio panic, calls that led drivers into isolated lots where people waited. They mentioned a disappearance from a week prior, a driver who'd pulled over and never been seen again. At the time, they called it under investigation, in-def radio, but they confirmed they were checking the spots along that stretch. That was the first time I learned that something like this could be organized. I don't think those guys were fooled by the chances we give people on the road. They'd trained for ambushes, they said. The state trooper asked me a list of questions, took a statement. He told me to keep my dashcam footage if he had any. I didn't then. I do now. After that night, I bought a forward and rear dashcam with time-stamped footage and a CB recorder. I changed my routine, parked at truck stops with security gates, and I started sleeping in goddamn motels when I had the truck paid for. Didn't feel brave anymore. Felt watched.
So that's how it starts in Arkansas. A voice on a CB, hazard lights that look too clean, a staged scene to draw you off the highway. If that unsettled you, hold on. It's only the beginning. If you're new here and want more true road horror, hit subscribe and ring the bell. There's more coming, and you'll want to hear it. The next voice comes out of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind is its own kind of weather, and lightning can flatten you to the seat. Highway 287, a storm closing in so fast the sky went from gray to black in 20 minutes. He was running time, deadlines, calls, the kind of schedule that makes you press when the horizon looks soft. There was a shoulder slick with rain, and a woman at the edge of the pavement thumbing a lift with a blue thumb and a soaked coat that clung to her like a second skin. He tells it like this: "You don't pick people up much anymore. Too many stories. But the storm was bad, and she looked like she might freeze." He slowed, tossed a glance in the cab mirror, where her face was pale and outlined by neon streaks. She climbed into the sleeper and immediately asked about his load, asked if he had cash, asked if she could ride to Amarillo. Small talk at first, the kind that lets you get a handle on them. Names, towns, where they were going. Then the rain got harder and she changed the subject. Her questions turned sharp. "Do you run without a tag?" she said. "Do you ever go through the back roads at night when the roads are quiet? There's a lot of money for drivers that are willing to stop and help." That's how it curling started. The driver noticed a set of questions getting too pointed, like a prodding nurse in a TV show trying to get a reaction. He was polite, distant, but the woman kept pushing and pushing, about money, cargo, if he carried electronics or cigarettes. Then she asked for a detour to a farm road that would add an hour but avoided a way station up ahead. When he refused, she pulled a knife. Not the little pocket knife you keep in your glove box. This was big, a hunting blade, black with a sheen the rain made more menacing. She said she needed to be paid for the ride. She said the detour was non-negotiable. He does something a lot of drivers say they'd never do in daylight. He rammed the back of a parked truck at low speed to make room for an escape. The collision was more of a shove, enough to make his bedlam of liars in the sleeper jolt her hand, and when she lunged, he twisted the wheel and hit the median. He told me he used the truck as protection, wedge and shield and momentum. At the median's turnoff, he threw her out of the door, out into the rain, onto the shoulder, then nailed the gas and left. You might wince at that, because it sounds violent. He told me he weighed the options in 2 seconds. She was clearly dangerous. He says he couldn't risk being held hostage and possibly killed over a load and a schedule. He called 911 once he was a half-mile away and described what happened. Troopers pulled her from under a bridge down the road, a known hustling spot, a place where people picked at trucks and drivers. Plates on her phone matched previous reports, the trooper told him. Repeat offender for highway robberies. They charged her with armed robbery. For him, the truck was both tool and weapon. He said he sleeps now with his keys in reach and always keeps the doors locked when he has a passenger. He carries an alarm and a CO2 canister, not to attack, he was careful to say, but to deter and make noise. The moral here was a hard one. He'd been raised with the idea of helping. But after that night, he stopped picking up hitchhikers, stopped assuming everyone's need was innocent. It changed him. Job rusted a little. Generosity hardened into guardedness. Stories like that force a trade, the small kindness we owe to each other versus self-preservation. For him, the night forced a choice. That's the kind of moral calculus most drivers don't want to have to make. By now, you might feel the pattern. An appeal for help, a shadow of menace, a real danger when the truck is used as a tool against its owner. The next one moves from human predators to the things we carry. Not everything dangerous on the road wears a jacket with a knife. Sometimes danger is sealed in steel and cold air. I heard this one from a driver who runs Route 2 across Michigan. Small shops to big distribution centers, and sometimes refrigerated freight when the money's right. He was contracted to pick up a sealed trailer with a paper manifest that said biological specimens. No more detail than that. The load was supposed to move overnight, secure chain of custody, white lab company name on the bill. He didn't think much of it until the box started to talk.
The first night he noticed a faint knocking, like a rhythm someone had been drumming from inside the insulation. That's a sound that gets under your skin in a big truck. You listen to every groove of metal and rubber when you're alone, so when the trailer made a noise that didn't belong to the engine, you're awake to it. He chalked it up to straps settling, to a crate shifting, but later that shift turned into a pattern. At a rest stop, he climbed into the back of the trailer with a flashlight. This is against protocol for a sealed freight, and he admits that now, but curiosity sat heavy and his driver's gut was prickling. He says he'd seen the seal, the tamper band, and his manifest sample matched what was on the door. Still, he had a feeling something else was in there. He put his shoulder into the door and felt a hit of colder air than a freezer should have. Inside, stacked crates were wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, the kind that fogs up when you shine a light. There was a sour metallic smell, sharp, not chemical like cleaning products, but like something that had been out of place for too long.
On the floor, near one of the wooden pallets, was a smear of dark fluid. He knelt, traced it with a gloved finger, and swore it moved under the light like a shadow. He called his dispatch, who told him not to touch anything and to get law enforcement. He'd already shot a few photos, because sinking dread makes men do small, useful things. He told dispatch exactly what he'd found: suspicious smell, thumps at night, fluid on the floor. Hazmat showed up and sealed the trailer off. They wore suits and masks, and a crew of county officers stood around with clipboards. The driver watched from a distance as they peeled away layers of plastic and began inventory. Later he was told the trailer contained slaughtered animals and parts, illegally processed, no proper tagging, and possibly unsanctioned wildlife shipments. The state ag people took over, and the case went forward as a violation. At least one owner was hit with fines. He told me the hazmat guys were green around the gills, and the officers were quiet. There were scratch marks along the inside walls, shallow but in irregular patterns, like something had been clawing at the inside, or crates shifted against lath and left deep gouges. He didn't claim it was a human voice or a living thing, just that the scratches made his hair rise. Another driver who took over the route told him about similar sealed loads, where paperwork looked correct but the odors and sounds were off. There was a whisper among the guys that sometimes sealed trailers are used to hide things no manifest will admit, and people had gotten out of a cab too late. He quit sealed loads after that. His reason was simple: visibility. When you know what you carry, you can manage the hazard. When you don't, the unknown becomes a danger. At this point the tone changes, from aberrant scams to things that feel organized, patient, and the kind of thing that takes planning and people willing to exploit the little kindnesses truckers give on a long night. But the road throws other kinds of threats at you, ones that aren't criminal in the ordinary sense, but bend the world into something that feels wrong. The next driver I spoke with was on Highway 80, the kind of stretch that runs long through emptier states and has truck stops that haven't changed a course since the Reagan administration. He was tired, and that's important. Fatigue makes perception malleable. It can also make you sharp in unexpected ways. He pulled off at a truck plaza that by all accounts didn't exist anymore. He told the story slow, like he was walking through a dream he'd half remembered. He stopped to fuel up at a place he'd used dozens of times, a chain that had renovated most of its stops. But this one was different. The sign over the pumps had a faded neon logo from the 1980s. The diner booths were vinyl cracked in a specific pattern. The jukebox in the corner played songs from a decade he swore no one today even put in coins for.
Men wore hats like you'd see in an old photograph. Trucks parked there had stickers of companies that folded in the early 90s. Even the attendant, a woman with a perm and an apron, had a name tag in handwriting you'd expect on a reunion invitation. He checked his watch. The highway timestamp said it was 2019, but everything around him smelled like the late 20th century. Cigarette smoke, that full-bodied smell of old tobacco, coffee that had been percolating all day. He told me he felt the hairs on his arm lift and the ache of hours on the road fall into a different rhythm, like being pulled into a memory. He asked the attendant how long the place had been open. The woman smiled a little too widely and said, "Been here a long time, hun? You from out of town?" He tried to take a picture with his phone, and the screen went gray, like a film had passed. His GPS flickered and showed a road that curved where the highway should be straight. When he stepped outside, a trucker he'd been talking to stepped into a '57 pickup that dissolved into a blur like a leaky camera film. He started his engine, hit the road, and when he turned the plaza on his map, it led him to an empty lot cleared for development. The building had a placard that said it burned down in 1984. He called it a glitch at first, an exhausted mind catching a ghost. He called a friend to tell him, and the voice on the other end told him there were old stories, folkloric talk among drivers, about a stretch of highway where time bent and truck plazas stuck in older decades drew people in. When he reported it to the local sheriff, they smiled politely, asked what exit, what mile marker. Official records showed no truck stop had burned there. Historical societies had nothing. Locals in the county had a half-remembered tale of a blaze many years back, but nothing confirmed. The more he looked, the more the place receded, like a memory stubborn to be pinned down. Whether you call it a time slip, a mass hallucination, or a personal breakdown, the thing he felt was real: disorientation and fear. He lost hours that night, he said. When he checked his log, there was a 2-hour gap nothing explained. He started sleeping with the cab light on after that for a long while, because quiet and menacing silence lives differently in an empty truck at 3 a.m. He stopped taking the back roads that run on the edges of the county and stuck to interstates he could map and trace. If that unsettles you, it should. The road is long, and sometimes the enemy isn't someone with a badge or a weapon. It's an absence of explanation and the way the mind fills it in. Drivers tell you the highway takes what it wants: time, youth, a sense of normal. For some, it gives back in strange pieces. A pattern is forming in these stories, a progression from small person scams to the uncanny, to stalking and organized crimes.
The next account walked me into something that began small and got louder: an invisible opponent using technology to get personal. He was a Midwestern driver on I-94 through North Dakota, the sort of steady guy who's been behind the wheel long enough to know every radio habit on Channel 19. It started with a soft static and a voice that said his handle, a nickname he'd used for years on the CB. He told me, "You learn you don't answer everything, but this one knew me by name," and that set the hair up. At first, it was a voice that teased, the kind that rides the edges of jokes. "Hey, Red, you remember that run back in Ohio?" The driver laughed and chalked it up to an old buddy. Then the voice shifted. It started bringing up specifics: dates, towns, an accident on a rain-slick bridge years ago where a truck had clipped a guardrail. The voice told him over and over that he knew what happened that night, that people died because of his choices. The harassment escalated over weeks. The CB messages moved from taunting to threatening. The voice knew his dispatch schedule, the name of his wife's sister, the time the driver took his daughters to school every Tuesday. How it learned those details, he couldn't say. He reported it to the Interstate Patrol, and they told him to keep logs, record the transmissions. The driver saved audio files. The voice said the sort of things that make a man do basic calculus about who knew what and how. It mentioned his tag number, an old phone number he'd changed years before, and then a county where a truck had gone missing. It felt like somebody had pulled his life out of his pockets and arranged it on the passenger seat. Eventually, the threats turned specific. "I'm going to find you on Route 2 when the fog rolls in," the voice said. "You can't hide." He started to change routes, to vary his stops, to have other drivers meet him at gas stations. It was paranoia that feels rational because of the facts being used against him. The stalking culminated in a night when a convoy of CBers and a squad car met him at a truck stop after he'd called for help. The FBI got involved because signals can cross borders, and because the voice was technical enough to suggest more than a bored bully. I'll be careful how I put this. Law enforcement traced signals, they said, and they arrested a man with equipment in his truck: radios, directional antennas, a stack of lists with names. He had been building files on people, collecting information he could use to terrorize and control. The driver I spoke to said the arrest helped, and the man is in custody according to the local U.S. Attorney's Office. But the sense of being known, the invasive thought that someone can watch through the channels you thought were just crackle and cake, that doesn't go away. He sold his rig 6 months later and moved closer to family. There's an ugly intimacy to being stalked through tools you rely on.
CB radio is a lifeline, a way to call for coffee or for help, and in this case, it became the instrument of threat. The lesson law enforcement gave him, keep records, record everything, report, and don't take it alone, was practical and cold. Evidence is what proves patterns, and patterns are what agents need to act. We're past simple scams now. The road has people who organize, who study how drivers operate and build methods to catch them off guard. And the stories keep stretching. The next one I'll tell you shifts the fear inward, into a place most people avoid thinking about. The freight itself can hide horrors no one wants to know. I spoke to him late at night, his voice flat, tired in that way that happens after you've seen something you can't forget. He was a local pickup driver for a small outfit in the Bakersfield area, a short haul, refrigerated freight, and when the pay was right, he'd take odd loads. One day he was told to pick up a refrigerated trailer at a warehouse that had gates, hazmat novices, and men in coveralls who moved with a practiced nervousness. The office man gave him a simple bill of lading: high-value perishables, urgent delivery, cash if needed. He loaded the trailer and drove it out into the dusk. Something hit him at mile marker 40, an odor that wasn't purely chemical or animal.
It was clinical in a way that made the back of his throat tighten. He pulled to the side, thinking he'd missed something on the manifest. He walked the length of the trailer and through the condensation and plastic saw people moving, shadows behind sheeting, hands working with tools. He couldn't make it out, but the plastic had been taped to block sightlines. The warehouse looked professional. Security cameras, sign-in books, men in suits that didn't fit their hands. He made the choice that most drivers say they hope they'd make. He called the police. He told dispatch the address, the description of men in hazmat, the way the trailer had fresh serrations along the metal where plastic had been cut and retaped, the smell. The dispatcher said help was on the way. He watched from the cab as a man in a dark jacket waved him off and told him to get moving, offering more cash for speed and discretion. He refused, told the man he'd wait for officers. 15 minutes later, a black van pulled up and 2 men got out. They were polite in a way that made him uneasy. "Look, buddy, we've got perishable goods that need moving." He told them the police were en route. They told them the troopers were delayed, so if he wanted to take the load and he'd be compensated. He didn't take the bait. What followed in the next few hours was a string of calls and then a raid. "I'm careful here." The driver told me what he saw through a window of plexiglass, and the officer's press release confirmed a raid on a network. FBI agents in plainclothes, hazmat suits, boxes marked as medical supplies that, upon search, contained illegal items.
The press release used measured language: illegal trafficking, unlicensed surgical activity, investigation ongoing. Officers found evidence that suggested illicit organ procurement in one warehouse. Bodies and medical waste were mentioned in the affidavit, and agents were careful to say they had warrants and were following leads. I won't describe the most terrible parts. The driver didn't need to. He said what stuck with him wasn't the physical evidence alone, but the casualness of the men unloading, the way they treated the trailer like a conveyor belt for anonymous freight. He hasn't slept well since. He tells me he had to look up what to do if you suspect something illegal in your cargo. You report, you don't touch, you get evidence to the authorities and let them handle it. He quoted the agent who took his statement. "You did right. You didn't look inside more than you needed to. You called immediately." I asked him if the network had been shut down. He said arrests were made and charges filed in several districts. Others remained indefinito as investigations continued. The official line was tight. Law enforcement couldn't publicly detail everything because of ongoing cases. But he'd watched men in suits take crates away, watched for more than an hour as officers wrestled with paperwork and boxes tagged with evidence stickers. The mental picture of doing the right thing and still feeling complicit because you moved the freight that night follows him. That guilt, he said, is what keeps him up. I could have let that story sit and let you imagine the rest, but I want to leave you here for a beat, to let the tension build. We've moved from setups that prey on kindness to the destructive use of communication systems to freight that hides horrors. The road's threats are professional, inventive, and sometimes human greed dressed up in paperwork. Drivers adapt because they have to. Dash cams, varied stops, reporting channels. But adaptation isn't a cure. There are more stories, some that step outside the comfortable laws of physics, and some that reveal criminal networks that treat way stations like hunting grounds. One of those waits on the next mile, a fake DOT stop that looks official enough to strip a driver of his normal defenses. But before we go there, there's one more thing I want you to consider. Each of these voices ended with a choice that kept someone alive or made sure a crime was discovered. They called, they recorded, they refused when their gut told them to. That pattern of doing small, deliberate things is the thin rod between being prey and being a witness. I'm going to tell you about the way station next, but listen to the last line this driver left me with. When you drive for 20 years, you learn numbers. You learn where to trust the road and where to leave no traces. But you don't learn how to forget the things the road shows you.
And then he checked his log, the one that had a page missing for the night he took that sealed load. He told me to hold on a second before he started the story, like he needed to clear his throat and make sure the sound of the highway wouldn't swallow him again. "If you don't believe the road can take you someplace," he said, "ask anyone who's lost a morning and found themselves 3 towns over with nothing on the log to explain it." He was a West Virginia hauler, an owner-operator who'd run the back roads between Appalachia and the Mid-Atlantic for 30 years. He called the place Millbrook because that's the name the old men in the diner used when they talked about the weird stretches. Nobody could agree where the town sat, and that was part of its power. He was running an overnight from a distribution center in Buffalo to a feed mill in the Ridge Country. The GPS blinked and rerouted him around an accident, down a county road he knew in daylight as the Scenic Cut. The sky was thin with fog that hovered off the Hollands like breath. He says the fog was the thing that made everything feel unreal. It muffled sound and flattened distance into a silver coating, so headlights became shapes, and every nearby tree could hide a face. He was tired, but not sleep-soaked. Just that steady weariness that makes your hands ache against the wheel. The first thing that was off was the signage. Mile markers that should have been reflective metal now looked hand-painted. The road narrowed and the white lines frayed into paint smears. At the top of a rise, he saw a billboard for a hardware store he remembered from his father's stories. The logo looked like something out of a newsreel. He thought at first he'd missed a detour sign. He followed the curve and came to a town, gas station, a single main street, and a line of storefronts whose awnings drooped with decades. A clock on the post read 11:47 p.m., but the faces of the men sitting on the curb was lit with cigarettes that smelled like a past his lungs knew. He pulled into the station to get a bottle of water, and his phone pinged like a fly trapped in a jar. No bars. The attendant, an older man in suspenders, tipped his cap and asked where he was headed. The driver told him, and the man said, "You're a ways off the interstate, friend. Best to park here and get a bite till fog lifts." Inside the diner, the jukebox hummed a country song he could hum the second verse to, a record he hadn't heard since he was a kid. He thought he might be hallucinating from the long haul, so he asked the obvious question, "When did this place open?" The attendant smiled and said, "Been here since the big snow of 23. The driver blinked. "23?" he said, meaning 1923. The man laughed and said, "You got me, son. Been here a long time. Folks keep to themselves." The driver tried to take a picture with his phone, and the screen went gray like a curtain. The GPS refused to lock on.
The truck parked outside his window was a faded two-tonner with a logo he had seen in a photo book of pre-war rigs, not something that rolled in the 21st century. He left cash on the counter and stepped back into the fog because the sky felt wrong. He tried the line of the highway. Where he expected mile marker 210, there was a bend that should have opened up to the interstate, but instead funneled into a gravel lane with a sign, hand-carved, Millbrook. He thought about turning around, but the fog had swallowed the path he'd come from. The trees made a wall, no road, just trunks stitched close like teeth. He describes the next hour like being inside quicksand, each minute thick and hard to swallow. Men he'd talked with inside the diner came out and told him stories about fairs that would be coming through next month, about a festival that used the same name his grandmother once told him. They asked him where he was from and if he wanted to stay the night. He told them no, but stayed because the fog made the idea of leaving worse than staying. On the counter, a paper announced a gala dated 1924. When he stepped outside with his coffee cup, the truck he'd parked beside earlier was gone, replaced by a Model A pickup that had only 3 lights. He says the pressure started then, not overt but subtle. A man at the town's edge suggesting the lane that leads back to the interstate was washed out and he should come to the community center for the night. A woman who insisted she knew the mountain roads because "my daddy built this stretch." She offered to show him a different exit through an orchard that would save time. It sounded friendly until he noticed they didn't take no for an answer. The air seemed to harden around refusal the way ice grabs at a boot. People circled, smiling, and the smiles never quite reached their eyes. He slept in the rig with the killer feeling that someone was watching each time his head nodded. He woke to find the truck's clock ahead of his watch by nearly 2 hours. His log showed a half hour where his memories were blank. He thought he'd do a loop, drive the lane back to the interstate the way he had come. He followed the hand-painted sign, and the road opened to a scattering of cornfields and a little bridge. On the far side, a woman stood in the ditch with a box in her arms and a baby stroller. He stopped, rolled down the window, and asked if she needed a hand. She didn't look up. "You can't be leaving," she said instead, as if the question had been about reasons and not directions. The hair on his arms rose. He hit the gas. The truck bounced over a washboard stretch, and suddenly the radio came alive. Static and a voice in a pitch he knew from long nights. The automatic announcer of a CB telling him about a way station. He slammed into the interstate and watched the town fade like a smear of paint through windshield water.
He crossed the mile marker the GPS had initially rerouted him off at and found his log had a 2-hour gap he couldn't explain. He was not gone from the road, the odometer showed, but his arrival times didn't add up. He checked surveillance tapes at a nearby rest area the next day, and the footage had a blank patch, like someone had cut 18 minutes from a reel and spliced it out, leaving a jump cut from 22 to 40 minutes later. The county sheriff's office told him their cameras sometimes froze in heavy fog. Historians and the librarian clerk in the county seat pulled newspapers for him and found a small story about a diner fire decades ago, but nothing matching the name Millbrook. The more he asked, the more the map hid the place. That was the strangest scar, he said. Not the hours swallowed by fog, but the way people responded. Locals told him that's the way things were in the hollers. Stories get spun and die like moths against glass. The sheriff suggested he might have misread a turn in exhaustion. Even his family listened with polite brows and then asked him whether he'd been sleeping properly. He'd been, he swore. The fog had made him something else, wary of any bit of the highway that rubbed too close to a photograph. After that run, he shortened his routes. He started carrying a paper atlas again, and a friend met him at odd checkpoints. He found himself looking over shoulders more often, counting exits, measuring time the way a watchmaker measures gears. He began therapy. The images of faces that wanted him to stay for the night didn't leave. He stopped taking routes that cherry-picked county roads at midnight. He said he'd always been a man whose life belonged on the road, but the road had left a piece of his trust behind. When I asked what he thought had happened, a misfiring brain under stress, a folklore nodding into reality, something stranger, he told me what the other man in the diner told him in low voices. Millbrook has been waiting for drivers a long time. He didn't press that claim into any grander truth. He used the word unexplained more than once. For him, the damage was practical: missing hours, a frayed sense of safety, nights he would never get back. What was worse, he said, was the polite dismissal from official channels. How do you prove a loss of time when the map shows nothing missing and the logs look neat? How do you make a complaint about a town that may not exist on any municipality's books? That ambiguity felt like a predatory thing all its own. If the fog unsettled you, know it's supposed to. The road can shift from hazard to trap in a heartbeat, and sometimes the most dangerous thing is not a person with a blade, but a place that does not answer to the rules you trust. After he finished, I asked the sheriff's office in the county where his detour ended if there had been reports of missing time or odd towns.
They were polite and brief. The office had received occasional calls about old buildings seen in fog and men in period garb over the years. All were documented as indefinito, pending corroborative evidence. The Historical Society had no records that matched the town name exactly. That didn't ease him. It only made the experience feel more solitary, like a story someone else's life could swallow and file away. You can feel the arc tightening now, from setups that used kindness as a weapon, to freight that hides bloodless horrors, to places that eat the clock, to people who weaponize the very signals drivers rely on. The last account is the one that reached beyond an individual prank or a local group of criminals. It's the kind of scheme that required logistics, fake credentials, and a terrifying amount of planning. For a long hauler on a long, lonely stretch of Route 97 in Oregon, a seemingly official way station turned into a close escape and the opening of an investigation that linked disappearances across multiple states. He was a veteran of the westbound haul, a man who could talk for an hour about fuel burn and tire pressures. He was tired, as long-haul drivers always are, but awake enough to notice the details that didn't sit right. It was a cool September afternoon when he passed a set of cones and a sign reading State DOT Inspection. There were cones, a folding table, a billboard-style banner with a logo that resembled the department's, and 3 men in high-visibility vests who raised their hands in the universal wave to pull over. What made him pause was the perfection of it. The banner looked printed the way an official agency would print it, and yet the font was slightly off, the seal a touch too glossy. The men carried handheld tablets instead of clipboards, and 2 of the badges on their vests were molted, not sewn. The inspector who approached had a patch that said DOT, but the stitching didn't match his memory of real patches. A lot of drivers would have rolled into the lane and settled like you do when you expect a competent procedure. He'd stopped because something in the way the inspector's smile didn't meet his eyes felt like the road's version of a liar's twitch. He killed his engine and stuck his hand out the window to get a feel for the men. One inspector asked for his bill of lading, and the other told him to step out while they conducted a quick inspection. Their order was calm, like water pouring over a rock. They wanted to see the axle weights, to run his manifest, and to check that the shipping seals were intact. Their scanner whirred and made a distinctive chime. The lead inspector told him to unplug his dashcam battery for regulatory compliance, because external recording creates chain of custody issues. He thought it was unusual, but the men were polite and had paperwork that looked right in a way that law enforcement paperwork often does, clear and purposeful.
He unstrapped his dash cam reluctantly and handed it over because he didn't want to make things difficult. Inside the office trailer, 2 men wearing those same vests guided a second driver's trailer into a yard area where other trucks were queued. That's when the odd things accelerated. One of the inspectors nudged the door open, and something cold and sweet hit his face, an antiseptic, like hospital air, and someone jamming at the little radio on his shoulder.
His phone lost signal. His CB went to static. A man in coveralls began unsealing the trailer he just parked. He watched through a gap as two men reached into the trailer and began unloading crates in neat, efficient stacks. They moved quickly, with the practiced hands of people who did this every day. The driver asked a question, and the men shrugged and told him to stay near his cab and wait while they did a cross-pull. He went back to his cab and sat very still, feeling the way men who have been in tight situations can feel their pulse move to a corner of the body. Something inside the yard made his skin tighten. He thought of tales, rumors drivers pass around at the pumps, about fake way stations used by rings to strip drivers, to take trucks, to stage hijackings. Those are the kinds of stories you tell late on a layover to keep the young drivers awake. He heard a phrase once, they mimic the state, and something in the way the men moved and in the equipment matched his worst imaginings. He called a name on the CB, a man who'd been his friend for years, and put his call out about being at a DOT check at mile marker such and such. There was nothing but static on the channel. At that moment, a pickup truck without plates cut across the entrance and blocked his exit. One of the men who had been at the trailer leaned into the open doorway of the pickup and laughed with the driver. That laugh did not belong in a real DOT inspection. He felt the hair on his arm stand up the way it does when you see a dog at a distance that shouldn't be there. He had an impulse to stay and be helpful, to be the good citizen who does as told. But that impulse warred with the sense that the protocols being offered were a theater production designed to disarm. He decided he couldn't wait. He went for the jammed radio and fumbled with his backup battery, the very thing the inspector had insisted he hand over. And the man at the table said, with a smile that had teeth missing, "Now, sir, the officer asked you to remain here. It's policy." There was an edge to the word policy that made his stomach drop. He unrolled and tried the lock on his trailer door with his fingers, and felt a sudden shove from behind that nearly toppled him into the dash. When he spun, a man with a sleeve covered in tattoos, not official ink, had his hand on his shoulder and was saying, "Relax, we'll get you on your way." He didn't relax.
He rammed the cab into gear and hit the back of the truck in front of him enough to pop the locked pin and make space. The pickup at the gate rose onto the curb as he weaved between cones and printers and a banner that flapped like a wounded flag. Men shouted. A man on a megaphone told him to stop. He shoved the wheel, racing for the shoulder, and a wire or a rope, something he didn't have time to identify, snagged and tore along the side of his trailer. For the next few minutes he was in a state that's hard to translate into calmer words, a mix of animal clarity and horror. He saw flashes, a wrench being raised, a man leaning into a second truck, the smell of brake fluid and diesel, and he pushed through it. He didn't slow for the gate. He drove through a chain-link fence, the truck grinding and scrabbling, metal clanging, and a spray of mud and willows. He hit the shoulder and kept going, across rutted earth, leaving the truck teetering until he had enough momentum to get back onto a service road. He saw men chasing on ATVs, but he was already building distance. A call to 911 on a cell phone that clung one bar answered with a dispatcher who took the information and told him state troopers were en route. He kept driving until he reached a genuine DOT station, where a real trooper did the kind of check that will make a grown man feel like he's been in a bad dream. A state police sergeant looked at his torn sidewall and the rips in his metal and told him to breathe. The sergeant radioed in another unit. A trooper interviewed him, took pictures of the fake badges and of the banner with the font slightly off. When the first patrols went back to the scene, what they found matched what he'd described. A yard repurposed with temporary banners, a trailer full of crates stacked like a shipping container for illegal goods, and, most ominous, an inventory log that had names that matched missing drivers' manifests. From there, federal agents took the lead. I'm careful about how I put this because the legal documents that followed were long and technical, and because court processes move slower than the stories we tell around pump islands. But what law enforcement said publicly was this: the site was a front. It had the trappings of legitimacy cloned from public templates, but the operation was a criminal one, designed to intercept trucks, strip assets, and in some cases to abduct drivers and move freight through a network of brokers. Arrests were made across multiple districts after coordinated raids on warehouses and fenced compounds. Authorities told the press they had evidence linking the ring to several missing person cases and a string of hijackings. Some suspects were taken into custody, and the investigation expanded across state lines.
I'll be precise where the records demand caution. Some charges resulted in indictments and prosecutions. Other leads remained indefinito, as agents continued to follow paper trails that crisscrossed brokers, cutout companies, and shell entities. The driver I spoke with watched men in suits cart away documents and saw evidence tags placed on crates. He was asked to keep a low profile as the FBI sorted warrants and affidavit redactions. The press releases used phrases like organized criminal enterprise and racketeering, which are large legal words meant to corral the chaos into statute. For him, the relief came slowly. Arrests helped, but the knowledge that a system could be copied, a logo, a patch, a temporary office, to build a trap stayed with him. The trust you place in an inspection can be weaponized by people willing to study the rituals of compliance and pose as authority.
When I asked what he did differently after, his voice sank. He stopped pulling over for unannounced roadside checks unless he could verify them through a dispatcher by calling the local state police to confirm an inspection. He hoarded his dashcam batteries. He learned to read the stitching on patches and to put his phone in airplane mode when a stranger asks him to hand over a recording. He met other drivers at known safe stops, and they formed an informal net of check-ins, a human directory in case the system someone built turned out to be a mirror for crime. You can feel the escalation sweep through the stories. What began as opportunistic ambushes and lone predators turns into sophisticated schemes that mimic public institutions. And that's where things become frightening, not only because of the immediate danger, but because the idea of official becomes unreliable. The worst part is that criminals studied the rituals of trust and learned to imitate them, and institutions can be slow to adapt. That's why these men told me the same thing in different ways. Record, report, and don't travel alone when you can avoid it. They did not present it as a cure. It's a set of small shields in a world that refuses big guarantees. Across all the voices, from the Arkansas driver who smelled something staged in hazard lights, to the Texas driver who had to throw a passenger out into the rain to save himself, to the Michigan flatbed driver who found hidden horrors in sealed crates, to the West Virginia man who lost hours in fog, to the Oregon long hauler who drove through a fake DOT gate, a few threats repeat. One is the weaponization of trust. Kindness and routine are predictable, and predictability can be exploited. Another is the ambivalence of technology. CBs that call for help can also carry threats. GPS reroutes can deposit you into strange old towns. Dashcams can fail or be confiscated under a pretense. Third is the social isolation of the profession. Hours away from friends and family leave drivers vulnerable to schemes that prey on loneliness and routine.
There is, however, a counter-threat of agency. Drivers who called it in, who recorded what they could, who kept cool enough to get away or to anchor an investigation. Law enforcement appears across the accounts not as deus ex machina, but as a procedural actor. Troopers who took statements, FBI agents who coordinated warrants, county hazmat teams who sealed suspect trailers. These interventions mattered. They turned near misses into leads and rumors into evidence. We close with practical things the drivers I spoke to wished they could have known before they learned them the hard way. I'll keep these sensible and non-prescriptive, because the aim is to increase survival, not to arm someone with techniques to evade lawful authority. First, keep recordings where you can. A time-stamped dashcam with a secure backup can be decisive when proving a pattern of harassment or showing the layout of a suspicious checkpoint. Record CB encounters when safe to do so. An audio file can be more useful than a memory. Second, share your plan. Tell a dispatcher, a friend, or a trusted company rep where you'll be, and check in on schedules so people can notice anomalies. Third, if a stop or a person at a stop doesn't feel right, distance is your friend. Stay in public, lit areas when possible, and if you can, delay until you can verify identity or until other trucks are present. Fourth, report suspicious behavior immediately to local law enforcement and to company dispatch. Evidence is what enables agencies to go after rings. Finally, take trauma seriously. Many drivers I spoke with had trouble sleeping after the fact, or shifted careers because the psychological toll outweighed the paycheck. If an experience lingers and intrudes on your life, seek professional support. These are the pragmatic takeaways from people who survived. I don't close with pat assurances. The road is a place where anonymity and distance trade in both freedom and risk. Some of these stories end with arrests and investigations. Some end with questions that remain open. One driver still counts his steps from the cab to the fuel pump. Another sold at his rig after a stalker got too close. The West Virginian still pauses at any sign painted by hand. The man who ran into the fake DOT still dreams of badges. The baggage they carry is as important as the cargo they haul. If you're a driver or someone who cares about someone who drives, I asked you at the outset to subscribe if this kind of road horror is the content that interests you. Now I have one more favor. Have you or someone you know been in a situation like any of these? Maybe you've been stopped at a checkpoint that didn't feel right, or you found a sealed load that smelled wrong, or you've had a voice on the CB that knew too much. Leave a brief account in the comments. Keep names and specifics to a minimum for safety, or share this video so other drivers and those who love them can be warned.
These stories are more than entertainment. They are warnings, and they become data when people pass them on. The last voice I heard in these interviews said something quiet and true. The road is honest in one way. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. People on the road can be the same. The trouble is, There are people who learned to wear that honesty like clothes and then stepped out in someone else's skin. That's what ties these 8 stories together, a pattern of disguise, of imitation, and of exploitation. The way forward isn't to stop driving or to give up on kindness. It's to sharpen the tools of survival, the camera, the log, the call, and to make sure the road's ordinary rituals don't become traps. For the drivers who told me their nights and the small, pulpy courage it takes to keep going, thank you. For the listeners, take these as caution, not as doom. Share them with someone who needs to hear, particularly if they're on the highway tonight. If you have a story, leave it below. Keep it brief. Stay safe out there. The highway is long and its shadows are patient, but so are the people who watch one another's backs.